Today, the only tramway on the Indian subcontinent is here in Calcutta. Once there had been 7 British-built, financed and operated tramways. Now this is the sole survivor. There were also a handful of trolleybus systems, one of which opened as late as 1975 and is still operating in truncated form. This exotic excursion into the electric traction delights of the Indian subcontinent begins on the island of Sri Lanka, the one-time British colony of Ceylon. For any visitor arriving by sea, their first view of the trams would be at the fort adjacent to the main jetty. Although most of the more wealthy Europeans alighting from the steamers opted to travel by car or rickshaw, some did board the waiting trams. Here a well-dressed crowd clambers first on board one of the original open-sided toast racks, and then onto one of the locally built centre entrance standards. These sequences show the locally built standards modernised in the late 30s with centre entrances. The compact 7.5-mile system dating from 1898 had been financed by British capital. Owned and operated originally by the Colombo Electric Tramway and Lighting Company, the system had been passed into municipal control in 1944. The original fleet consisted of 24 open crossbench 2-axle cars. Number 7 was one of the original 1898 crossbench cars, but in rebuilt form. A 2-class fare system was in force. Over the years, the fleet had undergone many alterations and additions, so that by the mid-50s there were 4 basic body designs. The oldest were the 1898 cars, which after 1943 were progressively modernised with new sheet metal bodies. They had interior longitudinal seating. The locally built standards dated from 1913 onwards. These had been rebuilt in the late 30s with centre entrances and 2-and-2 seating. There was also a more modern-looking standard. A few of these had rear as opposed to centre entrances. When the late Gwyn Thomas called in at Colombo during a voyage to Australia in the mid-50s, he made this unique record of the 2 surviving routes. The other, a short shuttle, having been absorbed into a new trolleybus route worked by British-built double-deckers. The city authorities had decided to replace its trams as early as 1950, and the first trolleybus route was actually completed during 1951. However, following a lengthy dispute with the electricity industry, the first conversion did not take place until July 1953. Standing at the front of the car, Gwyn Thomas took this unique record of the run out to Grand Pass as the four-wheeler progressed slowly along the narrow streets. The whole network was double track, except for a very short length of single track outside the depot. While serving in the forces, several enthusiasts did visit Colombo in the years immediately after the war, by which time there was no sign of any of the handful of bogie cars which had entered service before 1914. Having obtained permission from the then manager, Richard Wiseman had toured the 13-road depot and works on the 15th of December 1945. He noted it was well equipped, with 6 roads given over to overhauls and storage. Owing to wartime shortages, out of a total fleet of 52 cars, only 32 were in service. Approaching Armour Street, served by a mile-long shuttle route until replaced by trolleybuses in July 1953. At the junction, a glimpse of an ex-LT single-decker and one of the early double-decker trolleybuses, the first 35 of which were all BUTs. The terminus at Grand Pass was some 3 miles from the fort. Journey time back to town approximately 30 minutes. In 1945, 9 cars had been required to provide a 5-minute headway. Shortly after Gwyn Thomas took these sequences, the government would nationalise all other road transport in 1957 except for the trams and trolleybuses, a move which undoubtedly hastened the demise of the remaining trams. Originally having a mix of controllers, from 1945 onwards most were fitted with DK13s. BUT trolleybuses had a mix of Weyman and East Lancashire bodies. The final 2.5 miles of tramway were replaced on the 30th of June 1960 by a fleet of 26 Sunbeam single-deckers with East Lancashire bodies. Sadly, this well-constructed system hardly paid for itself, being replaced as from the 2nd of December 1964 by ex-London Transport RTLs, many of which would remain on the island in ever worsening condition for many years. Northwards now into the mountain kingdom of Nepal, home of the legendary Gurkhas, and also to the subcontinent's only surviving trolleybus system at Kathmandu, which opened some 10 years after Colombo ceased operation. Following close collaboration with the Chinese, a single route was opened on the 28th of December 1975. This followed the main road linking the capital, Kathmandu, with the ancient town of Bhaktapur. The fleet consisted of 22 Chinese-built, Shanghai-type left-hand running SK541s. Each vehicle had a crew of 2, including a roving conductor. Mike Russell took these scenes along the 13-kilometre route in 1989. Some years later, a further influx of Chinese-built trolleybuses would arrive, but by 1999, 10 years after these sequences were filmed, the whole operation was said to be in poor condition, so much so that only half the fleet was roadworthy. As a result, on the 19th of December 2001, the route would be abandoned. But in September 2003, it did partially reopen, and this truncated portion is still believed to be operating today, but with just a handful of vehicles. Whether the 13-kilometre route will ever be reactivated throughout remains to be seen. The next exotic destination is the one-time capital of Pakistan and now the country's major port and trading centre. No photographs have come to light of either the steam or horse tramways, but fortunately film does exist of the fuel-powered trams which ran for over 60 years. Dating from 1924, 94 was the first of a new design of 51 petrol trams built by the East India Tramways Company. After the war, 13 cars were built with diesel engines. Fuel pumps dominated the entrance to the depot and works facility off Bunda Road. Karachi's first couple of English-built petrol trams had displaced some horse trams in 1909. Then the British-financed East India Tramways Company gradually expanded its operations until the system was more or less completed by 1916. Conversion from petrol to diesel started in the late 30s, just before the system was acquired by the Muhammad Ali Tramways Company. Ray Muller, a captain in the American Merchant Navy, took these scenes shortly after his ship had docked. Latterly, service on this 3-mile route to the port only operated at peak times, ferrying dock workers to and from central Karachi. All the cars were 28 feet long and rode on 8-foot wheelbase trucks. Latterly they had simplex gearboxes and Perkins P4 engines, mounted beneath the centre seat. Look out for telltale wisps of exhaust fumes. During his visit, Jeff Todd captured all the atmosphere of this bustling tramway, with its fleet of 64 virtually identical vehicles. All seated 50 passengers on 5 sets of back-to-back benches with padded backs. Those seats behind the driver were officially reserved for ladies only. The conductor made regular use of the footboards, and in bad weather, shutters could be lowered. Drivers had a throttle key, a gear lever and a clutch pedal, as well as the usual foot-operated gong. All this equipment would have to be transferred at each stub terminal, where there was also a waiting supply of watering cans for filling the radiators. The only braking was by means of a handbrake at each end. Most visitors recall the trams as being quite nifty, with a top speed of about 25 miles an hour. The 10-mile system was mostly double track, but there were some sections of single line working. Approaching the main terminus at Boulder Market, with its unusual roadside loading. Only cars heading for the port proceeded beyond this point. It is believed that the entire network closed altogether in 1972. Despite its huge population, India only had 5 operating tramways and 2 trolleybus systems. No film has come to light of the trams of Cawnpore, Madras and Delhi, nor the system at Benares, which was built but never opened. Hugh Bourmont did take these rare slides of Delhi's meter-gauge trams in late 1961, shortly before the system closed. Delhi had also been home to an experimental trolleybus operation. These cars probably dated from the opening of the system in 1908. The Bombay Electric Supply and Tramways Company, or BEST, always prided itself on copying London's lead, even down to naming one group of cars the LCC class. Horse trams had first arrived in 1874. Electrification began in 1907 and the last extension opened in 1935. After the war, ownership of the BEST passed to the Bombay municipality, together with some 420 trams. A tramway replacement programme was instigated in 1953, and by 1964 the entire 31-mile system would be gone. Only one route, the 3.5-mile 10, was replaced by trolleybuses. However, the 12 Skoda single-deckers had a very short life, lasting from June 1962 to March 1971. By the beginning of 1960 there were still approximately 150 cars, the oldest being the survivors of a once numerous class of coupled two-axle trains. The other single-deckers came from New York. 25's Third Avenue cars similar to these were dispatched to India under the Marshall Plan in early 1949. On arrival, their bodies were narrowed, the doors removed, and the platforms tapered. For British visitors, it was the double-deckers that impressed, although the original 15 single truckers had all gone by 1939. However, most of the 58 bogie cars built by the company in the early 20s were still active in 1960. In deference to London, they were known as the LCC class and rode on LCC-type maximum traction trucks. Between 1934 and 1951, the company built a further 48 upgraded versions. Also still in evidence in 1960 were most of the one-time fleet of 23 centre entrance Pullmans dating from 1937 to 1939. However, shortly after independence in 1947, these Pullmans had had their centre doors removed. Sadly, no film survives of this magnificent state-of-the-art 86-seater built by English Electric in 1932. These next sequences were filmed at various times between 1960 and 1963 by Messrs. Collinson, Santarelli and Todd. First, views of cars on routes replaced during the first swathe of closures in the early 1960s, although precise closure dates are not always known. The lines serving Tardeo and Gwalior Tank were amongst the busiest on the system, requiring over 50 cars in rush hours. Rare views of the two-axle coupled trains. Action in the Tardeo-Gwalior tank neighbourhoods. The final line to remain was a truncated portion of Route 5, operating every 7.5 minutes between Boribunda and Dardie. These next sequences follow the 5 and 5A when they were still working the full 8 miles from the city centre to King's Circle by a mix of Pullmans, LCC and X3rd Avenue cars. In peak hours, 55 trams have been needed. On leaving the city's museum terminus, the fives headed past several imposing Victorian civic buildings before making their way northwards towards Dardie. Due to the height of some floats in the city's religious processions, the overhead was set very high at 21 foot 9 inches. En route there was evidence of recently abandoned lines. Reminiscent of modern layouts in English cities like Birmingham, Leeds and Liverpool, the final 3 miles was on Central Reservation, the last section of which dated from June 1935. The decision to abandon the loss-making system seems to have been based on rising electricity costs, over-cheap fares, and the opening of the Ashok Leyland bus plant. Also, the company may well have opted to follow London's example by implementing a tram scrapping policy. One of the former centre entrance Pullmans. another recently repainted Pullman. Although no official ceremony was arranged to mark the final closure, thousands thronged the route, applauding Car 103, packed to the gills, as it processed slowly into the history books on the 31st of March, 1964. Following the closure, 45 sets of maximum traction trucks, controllers and motors were sold for further use in Calcutta. Although the Calcutta Tramways Company did remain British-owned for many years following independence, it was managed by the state of West Bengal after August 1967. Now the state-owned CTC operates India's last surviving tramway. The Calcutta story begins with a short-lived meter-gauge horse line opened in 1873. This was followed by a larger network of lines, probably built to the 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge. These were opened progressively by the Calcutta Tramways Company between 1880 and 1884. At times, steam trams were also used. Electric trams first appeared in 1902, and for the next 30 years a variety of two-axle, first-class single-decker motor cars were built, together with matching second-class trailers. Starting in 1948 and continuing well into the 60s, many were rebuilt and permanently coupled together. Known as streamlined trains or utility cars, M-Class numbers 1 to 179 were of special interest to visiting British enthusiasts, as some had trucks acquired from systems such as Leeds, Leicester, Oldham and Stockport. Eventually their collection of inherited motors would be replaced by imports from Hungary. These M's feature prominently in the following film sequences, taken between 1960 and 1978 by Messrs. Cunningham, Healy, Matthews, Santarelli and Todd. The CTC never operated double-deckers and only a handful of conventional bogie cars. These were J-Class numbers 301 to 306, built by English Electric in 1931 on maximum traction bogies. Somewhat rebuilt, this view shows one later in life, coupled to a four-wheel trailer. English Electric also provided the first three examples of the much more successful K-Class. Like the J's, 307 to 309 were delivered in 1931. Referred to by the CTC as the articulated or English cars, a further 180 Ks, numbers 310 to 489, were built locally between 1932 and 1939. Conceived and first tested in England, each end has a powered maximum traction truck with an unpowered equal wheel truck under the articulation. All the truck's motors and controllers coming from English Electric. Like the J-Class, they were fitted with air brakes, as were all subsequent new cars. The Ks had two entirely separate body sections, each with its own drop centre entrance, there being no physical connection between the first and second class saloons. The official overall capacity of about 120 was often exceeded. During the early 60s, when these sequences were filmed, most Ks still looked relatively smart in their grey and cream, a colour scheme which had displaced the original chocolate and cream with delivery of the Js and Ks in 1931. After the Ks came the Streamline L-Class articulateds 490 to 559, built between 1942 and 1951. When first delivered, these cars supported a top-heavy cowling on the roof of the first-class saloon, which had concealed the resistances. As on these post-war Ls, this cowling was later reduced in size. Like the Ks, each car carried a crew of 3, supplemented in P cars on the busiest sections by extra conductors, known as line conductors. Although all their equipment was from English Electric, the Ls differed from the earlier Ks in riding on 3 equal wheel trucks. During the 50s, several Ks had been rebuilt with lengthened bodies and slightly different rear ends to the Ls. In this view, the rebuilt K is on the left. This shows the more rounded front end. Nonapuka Works handled everything from building new bodies to keeping older veterans on the road. When the state took over the company in 1967, it had envisaged phasing out the trams by the early 70s, but oil prices, pollution, and a change of heart by planners led to the decision to retain the system. Using some of the second-hand equipment purchased from Bombay, 201 to 206 entered service in the mid-60s. These were experimental first-class PAYE cars. Several older vehicles were also adapted for PAYE and painted in this striking cream and blue livery. However, the PAYE concept proved impractical and was dropped about 1970. There was no doubt the trams played a major part in moving Calcutta's millions. For example, in 1959 there were some 26 services operating from 8 depots over the 42-mile system, and they carried a staggering 400 million passengers. Prior to the introduction of route numbers in 1958, coloured symbols and lights had been used. One of the most impressive structures in Calcutta is the 28,000 tons New Howrah Bridge, opened in 1943. This cantilever structure allowed trams to cross the Hooghly for the first time. It also ended the long-standing isolation of 3 local lines in Howrah. Although photography of or in the vicinity of the bridge was strictly forbidden, these next sequences capture the bridge in all its glory, with the trams arriving and departing from their terminal loop outside Howrah station. By the early 60s, most shorter distance commuter trains were EMUs, but with steam still covering longer distance journeys. Until their complete closure in 1971, the 2-foot gauge Martin's Light Railway services terminated at Howrah Maiden Station, opened in 1948. Most of the tiny locos had been built to the same design by Hunslet between 1906 and 1955. Every day, endless hordes of commuters battle their way onto the non-stop procession of overladen trams and floor-scraping buses. In the early 60s, most local bus operations had been nationalised, with passenger loadings exceeding 500 million per year. Howrah's 3 local routes, which serve some of the worst areas of urban deprivation, never offered first-class accommodation. Because the Sibpur line ended in a stub with a trolley reverser, Howrah Depot maintained some 30 double-ended C and D class cars. Starting in 1960, a few were given new bodies. a rare view of E-Class 297 with a trailer in Howrah in 1961. Crippling congestion would lead to suspension of the two Bandagat routes in October 1970. The three locals, 40, 41 and 42, had their own loop close to the station. A short distance from the loop, the Bandagat route swung away to the right, whilst the Sibpur cars turned left. Note inbound E-Class motorcar and trailer. The last local, the 40, was abandoned on the 5th of December 1971. The Sibpur cars crossed the long bridge spanning the approaches to Howrah station and the tracks serving the many riverside wharves. After the closures, most of these elderly two-axle cars crossed the river, where a few, freshly painted, ran as single first-class only units. Then in the mid-70s, others were transformed into the final batch of streamlined trains, for which the company also built brand new trailers. Given the numbers between 180 and 192, some appeared in this somewhat garish livery. "172 was mounted on ex-Stockport trucks. Bran Healy filmed the trams in 1978, immediately before the CTC received an injection of cash from the World Bank, which enabled them to embark on some long overdue modernisation. For example, many of the articulateds will be given new or totally refurbished bodies. The city was also in a state of ongoing upheaval as it struggled to build its first metro. This would eventually impact on the tramways, leading to closures and route alterations. At its maximum, the large CTC fleet had been accommodated in 8 depots. Joining the fleet between 1974 and 1976 had been 27 company-built deluxe or Sundari articulateds, most of these riding on ex-Bombay maximum traction trucks. Later known as Class S, there were some differences. For example, the majority were first class only. Some also had twin as opposed to single headlights. However, all 27 had single-piece windscreens and roller-blind destinations. When Alan Morrison made his visit in November 1980, large areas of the city were in a state of upheaval due to metro construction. Here Rail Scrubber 2, complete with its drinking water trailer, rolls into Esplanade. Redesigned in 1952, Esplanade consisted of an amazing spider's web of loops and sidings. This was the system's operational hub. Except for one instance, all other termini had turning circles. Watching these action-packed sequences allows time for a few comments on the state-owned company's labour relations in the early 80s. The huge workforce of nearly 9,000 employees meant that for every tram there were nearly 32 men. Drivers and conductors received equal pay, with the latter also getting bonuses relating to the amount of fares collected. A driver received 4 months training, a conductor 3 weeks, but also had to demonstrate a grasp of the 3 major languages, Hindi, Bengali and English. The company also had a strong family tradition, as most men on retiring at 60 could nominate their own successor. Graham Mather was one of 12 British enthusiasts to make an extensive study of the tramway in October 1980. During the trip, Graham produced this remarkable record of the system, including many sections which, since opening of the metro, have subsequently closed. His coverage begins on the heavily used link from Howrah station across the Hooghly. By this time, many cars were carrying a harder-wearing dark blue paint scheme. Turning from Strand Road into Hare Street. At BBD Bag, formerly Dalhousie Square, which in 1980 was terminus for some 10 lines, as well as numbers of frequent short workings. Looking far from beautiful, this battered Sundari means beautiful in Bengali, trundles in on the 25, with clear evidence that its roller blinds were no longer working. Brighton Junction. Mahatma Gandhi Road. On October the 22nd, the party boarded Sundari 580 in Gariahat Depot, now closed. The wire netting screens had first appeared in the late 40s to protect drivers from periodic outbursts of protest. Outside the depot, a car travels along the reserved track linking Park Circus to Gariahat Junction. By July 2004, this section had been lifted. Time was allowed for filming on the reserved track along Rash Bihari Avenue. Crossing over the boat canal at Marjahat en route to Bihala. A former PAYE car on ex-Bombay trucks is seen on Diamond Harbour Road. Bihala Terminus. At the end of 1986, a 4.5-mile extension would be opened from here to Joka, where the company also built a new depot.